My name is Marissa Cole. I am 34 years old, and 11 days ago, my ex-husband's new wife called me at 11:47 at night, crying so hard I could barely understand her. I was sitting on my couch, grading through a stack of client files with the television on low in the background, and when I saw her name light up my screen, a number I hadn't heard from in almost a year, my first thought wasn't concern. It was recognition, the specific, quiet dread of a phone ringing at an hour when nothing good has ever once been on the other end of it. When she finally got the words out, she asked me one question. "What did you mean by ask him about the basement?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit there, the way I let a spreadsheet sit there when the numbers don't reconcile, because silence is where people tell you the truth if you just wait long enough. Then I said the only sentence I had been saving for 3 years. "So he hasn't shown you yet." And I hung up. I want to tell you why I said that. I want to tell you what was actually in that basement, because it wasn't a body, and it wasn't a secret room, and it wasn't anything you're picturing right now. It was a locked steel filing box, bolted into a stud wall behind a sheet of drywall that had been painted over twice. And inside that box was the reason my ex-husband's mother's estate was about to collapse in 12 days, the reason a bank was about to void a loan with my name forged on it, and the reason a woman I had never met was standing in her own basement at midnight, holding a flashlight in one hand and a stack of papers in the other, reading my name on a document she had never seen before. Welcome back to Calm Karma Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and come out the other side with their dignity intact. If you've ever been the one who quietly kept the receipts while everyone else just kept talking, this story is for you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe, because what happens in the next 12 days is the part nobody in that family saw coming. But let me back up. Let me take you back 4 years to the first time I ever heard the phrase that ruined my marriage and eventually saved it from being the biggest mistake of my life. I'm a certified fraud examiner. I spent 6 years in the asset verification department of a regional bank before I went independent, which means my entire career has been built on one skill: noticing when numbers that are supposed to match each other don't. Loan applications, estate filings, payroll records. People think forensic accounting is about big dramatic reveals, but it's not. It's about patience. It's about staring at a column of figures until the one wrong entry starts to look louder than all the right ones around it. I have a habit, one I've had since graduate school. Before I open any file I'm about to take seriously, I click my mechanical pencil 3 times. Click, click, click. It started as a joke, actually. Something a professor of mine used to do before he'd walk students through a case study riddled with hidden errors. And I picked it up without really meaning to, the way you pick up your parents' laugh or your best friend's turn of phrase. It's a stupid little ritual. My assistant used to tease me about it. But by the time this story is over, that pencil click is going to matter more than you'd think. I married Derek Holloway when I was 28. He was warm and funny, and he ran his family's construction and restoration business with an easy confidence that I found, at the time, magnetic. The Holloways were what people in our town called an institution, 3 generations of contractors. Half the porches and additions in the county had Holloway builders stamped somewhere on the permit. Derek's mother, Patricia, was the matriarch, and Patricia had exactly one phrase she used for every occasion, every disagreement, every request for money, every family gathering where someone needed to fall in line. She would put her hand flat on the table, look around at whoever was sitting there, and say it like a blessing and a warning in the same breath. "We protect our own." The first time I heard it, I thought it was sweet. A family that took care of each other. I didn't understand yet that in the Holloway house, protecting our own only ever seemed to mean protecting Derek, and that everyone else's job was to absorb whatever it cost. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for how the rest of this story lands. I was not the erased one in that family, not at first. I was the fixer. When Derek's permits fell behind, I was the one who reorganized his filing system so the county stopped sending warning letters. When his brother's child support paperwork got tangled, I was the one who found the missing form. I liked being useful. I liked being the person who made problems disappear with a few phone calls and a folder. I didn't understand, for the first 2 years of my marriage, that being useful to a family like that is not the same as being valued by it. Those are 2 very different things, and I would spend the next several years learning the difference the hard way. There was a Thanksgiving in our second year where that difference showed itself clearly for the first time, though I didn't recognize it as anything more than an odd moment back then. Patricia had invited 18 people to a house built to comfortably seat 10. Somewhere between the turkey and the pies, the good folding table Derek's brother Todd had promised to bring simply never arrived because Todd, characteristically, had forgotten. Patricia didn't ask Todd where the table was. She turned to me in front of the entire family and asked whether I could make a call and sort it out. I remember standing in the kitchen, phone against my ear, tracking down a rental company that would deliver a folding table on a holiday, while 12 feet away Todd sat with a plate of food, entirely unbothered, because somehow, without anyone ever saying it out loud, it had already been decided that fixing things was simply what I did, the way breathing is simply what you do. There was another moment, about 8 months later, when Derek's cousin's wedding got double booked with a venue conflict 2 weeks out, and again, it was my name that got mentioned first. Marissa will know who to call. I did know who to call because I always did the research, always kept the vendor contacts, always had the folder ready before anyone asked for it. I want to be honest about something. Part of me liked it. Part of me liked being the one people turned to when things were falling apart, because being needed felt, for a long time, close enough to being loved that I didn't examine the gap between them too closely. The first real crack showed up in year 2 when Patricia was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia. It was mild at first. She'd repeat a story twice in one dinner. She'd forget where she put her reading glasses while they sat on top of her head. Derek's siblings, his older sister Colleen and his younger brother Todd, both lived out of state, so it was Derek, and by extension me, who ended up managing most of Patricia's care logistics, doctor's appointments, medication schedules, and eventually her legal affairs, because somebody had to sit with her and the estate attorney while she updated her will. I sat in on that meeting. I remember it clearly because it was the first time I saw Patricia's handwriting shake. The will she signed that day split her estate 3 ways, evenly, between Colleen, Todd, and Derek. The construction business, the house, her savings, all divided equally. I remember thinking it was fair and simple, and that the family would never have to argue about it. I had no idea, sitting in that office watching her sign her name in slow, careful strokes, that I was watching the last version of that anyone outside the family would ever agree on. Here's the part that's hard to admit. About 8 months later, I started noticing small discrepancies in the Halloway Builders books. Not big ones. A supplier invoice that had been paid twice. A subcontractor account that showed a balance that didn't match the bank statement by about $4,000. I mentioned it to Derek over dinner, casually, the way you'd mention a leak under the sink. He told me not to worry about it, that the bookkeeper was sloppy, that he'd handle it. I let it go. That's the version of me I want you to remember for the rest of this story. The version who let it go the first time, because trusting my husband felt more important than trusting a spreadsheet. A few weeks after that dinner, Colleen called me directly, which was unusual, since Colleen and I typically only spoke through group texts about holidays. She asked, in a roundabout way that I didn't fully understand at the time, whether Derek had mentioned anything about the business lately. I told her about the small discrepancy, assuming she already knew and was simply checking in. There was a pause on the line, longer than the question warranted, and then she said something I didn't think about again for almost 3 years. Just keep your own copies of things, Marissa. That's all I'll say. I asked her what she meant. She said she was probably overthinking it and changed the subject to Todd's kids. I didn't press her. I wish, now, that I had. Then came the renovation. In our 4th year of marriage, Derek decided we should finish the basement of our house, the one we'd bought together 2 years in, using a small joint home equity line of credit. It made sense on paper. Property values were up in our neighborhood, we had equity to spare, and Derek wanted a home office down there, plus storage for the business's overflow paperwork. I remember signing what I believed was the HELOC application at our kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in March, a modest line of credit, $22,000, nothing that would have kept me up at night. I signed it, we shook hands with the loan officer over speakerphone, and I didn't think about it again for almost 2 years. I want you to hold on to that date. March, our 4th year. Because that document is going to come back into this story wearing a very different face. The basement renovation itself took 4 months, and it was during those 4 months that Derek started spending long stretches of time down there alone after the contractors had gone home for the day. He said he was organizing his tools or reviewing blueprints for a client project. I remember bringing him coffee down there once, around 9 at night, and finding him standing very still in front of that back wall with a level in his hand. Not actually leveling anything, just standing there. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was checking for moisture behind the drywall before it got painted, which at the time sounded like exactly the kind of careful, competent thing a contractor's son would say. I didn't question it. Why would I? A man in his own basement, working on his own house, is not a suspicious thing. It's only in hindsight, once you know what was actually going into that wall, that those long, solitary evenings start to look like something else entirely. Patricia's decline accelerated faster than any of us expected. By our 5th year of marriage, she needed full-time memory care, and that's when the second version of her will appeared. Derek told me, one night in bed, almost offhand, that his mother had updated some things with a different attorney, one recommended by a family friend rather than the estate lawyer we'd sat with years earlier. He said it was simpler now. He said his mother wanted the business to stay whole instead of getting split 3 ways and potentially sold off in pieces, so she'd left the majority controlling share of Holloway Builders to Derek specifically, with Colleen and Todd receiving cash equivalents instead. He said Colleen and Todd already knew and were fine with it. I remember asking him one question. Had his mother been evaluated by a doctor for capacity before she signed that new document, given her diagnosis? He said yes. He said it had all been handled properly. I believed him, because at that point in my marriage, believing him was still the default setting I hadn't yet learned to turn off. It was almost a full year later, 3 weeks before Patricia passed away, that I found the notary discrepancy. I wasn't looking for it. I was helping Derek scan some paperwork for his accountant during tax season, and one document simply happened to sit under the scanner glass a few seconds too long. It was a copy of the notarized signature page from the second will. I looked at it the way I look at every document, out of habit more than suspicion. Click, click, click. And something in my chest went cold, because the notary's registration number on that page did not match a valid registration in the state database. I checked, quietly, using the same lookup tool I used every day at work. The number came back invalid, not expired, invalid. As in, it had never been issued to anyone. I didn't confront Derek that night. I have never once, in my entire career, confronted anyone the moment I find the first anomaly, because the first anomaly is never the whole story. It's just the loose thread. You pull it slowly, in private, until you understand the whole garment before you say a word out loud. So instead of saying anything, I did what I do for a living. I built a file. I remember the exact moment I called the state notary board, because I did it from my car in a grocery store parking lot on my lunch break, with the engine off and the windows up, as if the privacy of an empty parking lot could somehow keep the question from being real. I gave the woman on the phone the registration number exactly as it appeared on the document, digit by digit, twice, in case I'd copied it down wrong. She asked me to hold. I sat there for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 90 seconds, watching people push shopping carts across the asphalt, thinking about how strange it was that my entire marriage might be balanced on the other end of a hold button. When she came back, she said the registration simply didn't exist in their system, active, expired, or revoked. It had never been issued. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in that parking lot for another 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Over the following months, quietly, carefully, I gathered what I could. A copy of the original 3-way will from the estate attorney's office, obtained legitimately, since I was still listed as a witness of record from that first signing. A copy of the second will with the invalid notary number. Bank statements showing that roughly 4 months before the second will was signed, a $14,000 cash withdrawal had come out of Derek's personal account, memo line blank. And a business card found in Derek's truck one afternoon while I was looking for a parking receipt for an expense report from a man named Gerald Wick, whose title read, in small gray print, Mobile Notary Services. I called the state notary board, not to report anything yet, just to ask, hypothetically, how someone would verify a registration. The woman on the phone confirmed what I already knew. There had never been a Gerald Wick licensed as a notary in this state. Patricia died 2 weeks after I confirmed that. And at her funeral, standing in a church that smelled like lilies and old wood, I watched Colleen and Todd shake hands with Derek's lawyer like people accepting a routine outcome, because that's exactly what they believed it was. A routine, uncontested reading of their mother's wishes. Nobody in that church except me knew that the will being read wasn't the one their mother had actually signed with a licensed professional standing beside her. Nobody knew, because I hadn't told them yet. I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't strategy, not at that point. It was grief and fear, and the simple paralysis of not knowing how to say out loud, in the middle of a funeral, that my husband might have forged his own mother's final wishes. Stay with me here, because this is where the story turns, and it turns fast. Subscribe now if you haven't, because what happened over the next 6 weeks is the part people ask me about the most. 3 weeks after the funeral, I found the second document. I was down in the basement, the finished one Derek had built, looking for a spare charger cable in what was supposed to be his home office closet, and I noticed something a contractor would notice before an accountant would. One section of the drywall, low on the back wall behind a filing cabinet, had a seam that didn't line up with the stud pattern of the rest of the room. It was subtle. Most people would never see it. But I had spent 4 months watching that basement get built, and I remembered exactly where the studs were supposed to fall, because I had stood in that room while the framing inspector walked Derek through it. This seam was 6 inches off from where it should have been. I stood there for a long time, longer than it takes to notice a seam, running my hand along the paint, feeling for a temperature difference, a texture difference, anything that would tell me I was imagining it. I wasn't imagining it. There was a shallow cavity behind that section of wall that had no business existing in a house with standard 16-inch stud spacing, and I understood, standing in that quiet room with the filing cabinet humming faintly behind me, that my husband had built something into our house that he had never once mentioned to me, in a room he had spent dozens of evenings alone in, supposedly checking for moisture. I didn't touch it. I want to be clear about that, because it matters later. I didn't pry anything open. I photographed it, noted the measurement discrepancy, and closed the closet door. Then I went upstairs, and I did the only thing that made sense to someone in my line of work. I began quietly protecting myself, using tools that had nothing to do with confrontation and everything to do with paper. The first thing I did was contact a family law attorney under the pretext of reviewing our estate planning and asked her, hypothetically, what happens if a spouse's signature turns out to be fraudulent on a jointly held loan. She explained that if I could prove a signature wasn't mine or wasn't authorized the way I believed it to be, I could file a sworn affidavit of forgery with the county recorder's office attached directly to the property record. It wouldn't undo the loan immediately, but it would place what she called a cloud on title, a formal, public, legally binding notice that a dispute existed, one that any future lender, buyer, or title company would be required to see and resolve before that property could be refinanced, sold, or used as collateral again. That's when I went back and pulled the actual HELOC file from 4 years earlier, the one I remembered signing at our kitchen table. Except when I compared the signature on that original application to my own signature on my driver's license, my passport, my notarized wedding documents, and 6 other legal papers from that same year, it did not match. Not in the way handwriting naturally varies day to day. It matched in shape, but not in pressure. Not in the tiny hook I always put on the final letter of my last name. A habit from childhood that never changes, no matter how tired or rushed I am. I had signed a small $22,000 HELOC that Tuesday in March. What I found in the file wasn't that document. It was a second, later modification, filed 18 months after the original, increasing the credit line to $98,000, with a signature that was close enough to fool a loan processor glancing at a stack of paperwork, but not close enough to fool the person whose name was actually on it. I sat with that for 2 full days before I did anything. $98,000. Against our house, with my forged signature. I went back through Derek's business account activity from that period and found the pattern I should have seen a year earlier. Subcontractor payments that didn't correspond to any job on the books. A wire transfer, the same week the modification was filed, to an account belonging to Halloway Builders' primary supplier, for an amount that exactly matched an outstanding balance I remembered him mentioning once, offhand, as handled. I want to say something plainly here, because I think it's the moment that defines everything I did afterward. I did not go to Derek and scream. I did not throw the papers on the table and demand an explanation. I have watched enough of this family's history to know exactly what happens to people who raise their voice at a Halloway. They get managed, they get soothed and delayed, and eventually worn down until the problem quietly disappears back into the family's control. I was not going to be managed. So instead, Over the next 6 weeks, I built a case the way I would build one for a client. I obtained certified copies of the original 3-way will from the estate attorney and had them notarized as true copies, and filed a formal notice with probate court flagging a potential forged instrument, supported by the invalid notary registration number I had already confirmed with the state board. I filed the affidavit of forgery regarding the HELOC modification with the county recorder, attaching my signature comparison analysis, which as a certified fraud examiner carries a specific kind of professional weight that a layperson's claim would not. And I quietly opened a separate account in my name only, moving what modest personal savings I had into it, not to hide money from a divorce, but because I understood, with total clarity, that once this came out, our joint accounts were likely to be frozen or disputed for months, and I needed to be able to pay a lawyer. Then, and only then, 12 days after finding the drywall seam, I told Derek I wanted a divorce. I didn't tell him why, not completely. I told him I felt disconnected, that the marriage had changed, that I needed space. He was surprised, hurt even, in a way that at the time made me second-guess myself for exactly one evening. Patricia's voice was in my head that whole night. We protect our own. I remember lying awake, thinking, if that's true, then someone should have protected me too. The divorce itself was quiet, almost embarrassingly civil from the outside. Derek didn't fight the terms I proposed, which in hindsight tells you everything about how badly he needed this to move fast and quietly. I asked for, and received, sole ownership of a small rental property we'd co-owned, in lieu of any claim on the house or the business, an arrangement that looked, to anyone watching, like a generous ex-wife stepping back gracefully. What it actually was me removing my name from anything connected to that mortgage and that HELOC as cleanly as the law would allow, while the forgery affidavit stayed exactly where I'd already placed it, permanently attached to the property record regardless of who lived there or who divorced whom. My own divorce attorney, a careful, unhurried woman named Renata, who I'd chosen specifically because she never once raised her voice in a meeting, asked me at our final signing session whether I was certain I didn't want to pursue anything further against Derek at that time, given what I'd shared with her in confidence. I told her no, not yet. I told her the affidavit and the probate filing would do more work, sitting quietly in place than any lawsuit I could bring in that moment, while I still had no idea when, or whether, the second will would ever actually be enforced, or when the HELOC would ever come up for renewal. Renata looked at me for a long moment and said something I still think about. She said most of her clients wanted justice to feel like a single dramatic afternoon in a courtroom, and that the ones who understood it was actually a slow accumulation of correctly filed paperwork tended to be the ones who came out the other side intact. I didn't know, sitting in her office that day, just how long I'd have to wait for that accumulation to matter. I only knew that I could wait. I never told Colleen or Todd what I'd found. Not out of loyalty to Derek, but because at the time, it wasn't my fight to hand them. I had protected myself. I had documented everything. And then I stepped back, and I watched. Derek remarried 14 months later. Her name is Callie. She's 29, works as a pediatric nurse, and from everything I've since learned about her, she is a genuinely kind, hardworking person who had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. I want to say that clearly, because this story is not about punishing Callie. Callie is, in almost every way that matters, exactly who I was 6 years earlier. Trusting, useful. Willing to believe the version of the family that gets presented at Sunday dinners instead of the one buried in a filing cabinet behind 6 inches of misaligned drywall. She'd apparently mentioned to a mutual friend, early in her relationship with Derek, how lucky she felt to be marrying into a family that seemed so tightly knit, so devoted to taking care of each other. I understood that feeling completely. I had felt it too, once, standing in that same kitchen, believing the exact same thing. They bought Derek's mother's old house from Colleen and Todd's shares of the settled estate, the same house where, apparently, Derek decided to finish the basement all over again, this time as a nursery, which meant tearing out drywall. Which meant, 12 days ago, a contractor named Ruiz Renovations pulling down a section of wall in a back closet and finding something bolted directly into the studs that had absolutely nothing to do with plumbing or electrical. A steel lockbox, the kind you'd use for a home safe, wedged into the stud bay and drywalled completely over, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, which of course, I did. Here's the part that's hard to admit, even now. When Callie called me sobbing at 11:47 at night, holding a stack of papers she'd found inside that box after her contractor pried it open with a crowbar out of pure curiosity, my first instinct was not sympathy. It was recognition. I knew, before she said a single word, that she was standing exactly where I had stood, in a basement that Derek had built with his own hands to hide the things he didn't want anyone to find. She told me the box had photographs, an old accordion folder of business documents, and a manila envelope with my name on it, unopened, that had apparently sat sealed inside that wall for over 3 years. Inside that envelope, it turned out later, were the original certified copies of Patricia's true, 3-way will, the ones I had personally paid to have notarized, the exact copies I had filed with probate years earlier, which meant Derek had somehow located and hidden physical proof of the very forgery I had already reported. He hadn't destroyed the evidence. He'd stashed it, the way people stash things they're too afraid to burn and too afraid to leave in the open. What none of us knew yet, in that first phone call at 11:47 at night, was that the timing could not have been worse for Derek, or better for the truth. The refinance he'd quietly initiated on the hillock was already moving through underwriting. Title company paperwork doesn't sit idle once it starts. There's a clock built into every closing, and that clock was already running before Callie ever picked up that crowbar. 12 days. That's how long it would be, I later learned, until the original balloon payment came due if the refinance failed to close in time, and exactly how long it would be until a title search, ordinarily a routine formality nobody reads closely, would surface a recorded affidavit that had been sitting quietly in the county system for 3 years, waiting for someone to finally need that title clean. Callie asked me what the papers meant. I told her, calmly, the way I tell any client the truth about numbers that don't reconcile, that she needed to call a family law attorney before she called anyone else, including Derek. Then she asked the question that started this whole story. What did I mean 3 years ago, when apparently, according to a voicemail she'd also found saved on an old phone in that same box, I had once told Derek, during our divorce, ask him about the basement. I had said that sentence to him once, quietly, on our very last phone call as a married couple, and I had never explained it, because at the time, I wanted him to sit with the not knowing of what I knew. So I hung up, and I picked up my own phone, and I made 3 calls. Stay with me, because what happened over the next 12 days is the part of this story people don't believe actually happens in real life. And yet it did, exactly like this. I made those 3 calls sitting at my own kitchen table at nearly midnight with a legal pad in front of me and my mechanical pencil in my hand, clicking it 3 times before I dialed the first number, the same ritual I use for every file I've ever taken, seriously. It felt strange, dialing numbers I hadn't needed in 3 years, waking up and on-call, answering service, leaving careful, unhurried messages instead of the panicked, rambling ones I imagine most people leave at midnight. But I have never once done my best work in a hurry, and I wasn't about to start that night. The first call was to the estate attorney who had handled Patricia's original will, confirming that my affidavit and certified copies were still active in the probate file, which they were, sitting quietly for 3 years, waiting. The second call was to the loan servicer that currently held the haylock on that house, informing them that a recorded affidavit of forgery existed on that property's title, and requesting written confirmation of how that would affect any pending refinance. It turned out there was, in fact, a pending refinance, one Derek had quietly initiated 11 days earlier to consolidate the HELOC into a lower fixed rate before the balloon payment came due, a balloon payment of just over $60,000, scheduled to hit in exactly 12 days from that phone call. The third call was to Colleen, Derek's sister, whom I had not spoken to in 3 years, to tell her, calmly and without a shred of drama, that their mother's true will had never actually been overturned in any way that would hold up, and that she might want to speak with the probate attorney handling the estate before anything else moved forward. I want you to understand the shape of what I was doing, because it's the whole point of this story. I wasn't attacking anyone. I hadn't broken a single law, hadn't forged a single document, hadn't raised my voice to a single person. I had simply, years earlier, quietly placed 3 pieces of paper into 3 official systems, a probate court, a county recorder's office, and a state notary board, and then waited for the ordinary machinery of those systems to eventually catch up to a lie that had been built to survive only as long as nobody looked directly at it. The refinance closing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, exactly 12 days after Callie's phone call, at the title company's downtown office. Derek had arranged for it to happen quickly and quietly, likely hoping to lock the new loan into place before Callie fully understood what she'd found in that box, and before anyone thought to check the title. Colleen, once she'd spoken to the probate attorney and confirmed that a formally recorded forgery claim, backed by a certified fraud examiner's signature analysis and an invalid notary number, had been sitting in the county system the entire time, decided she wanted to be present at that closing. So did Todd, once his sister called him. And so, ultimately, did I, because the title company's attorney called me directly, since my name and my certified affidavit were the actual legal cloud sitting on that property. And title companies do not close loans while an unresolved fraud claim sits attached to the deed. They needed my statement in person to even proceed with untangling it. I walked into that title company's conference room on a Tuesday morning in a plain gray blazer, carrying a single folder, and I clicked my pencil 3 times before I sat down, out of habit more than anything else. Derek was already there, along with Callie, who looked like she hadn't slept in days, and the title company's closing attorney, and a representative from the lending bank who had driven in from their regional fraud department once the affidavit had been flagged in their system overnight. Derek's plan, as far as I understand it, had been simple. Refinance the HELOC quickly, quietly, folding the fraudulent $98,000 balance into a new, lower-rate mortgage before anyone connected the dots between an old divorce, an old will, and a basement wall he'd built himself. He hadn't counted on Callie finding that box. He hadn't counted on Ruiz Renovations pulling down that particular section of drywall on that particular Thursday. And he certainly hadn't counted on the fact that I had never, not for one single day in 3 years, stopped being the kind of person who keeps the receipts. The bank's fraud representative opened the meeting by stating, plainly, that they could not proceed with any refinance while an active affidavit of forgery remained attached to the property, and that they would need a full signature verification review before any funds could move. A review that, given the certified analysis already on file, could take between 30 and 90 days, during which time the existing balloon payment obligation on the original HELOC would remain due in full within the week, regardless of the refinance status. I watched Derek's face when he understood that meant $60,000 in cash in 7 days with no refinance to cover it. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply sat with my folder closed on the table in front of me, because I had learned, years earlier, that the loudest moment in a room is not the one where you speak. It's the one where you don't have to. Colleen asked, directly, in front of everyone, whether the probate matter regarding their mother's will was connected to this same fraud claim. The title company's attorney, who had clearly done his homework overnight, confirmed that yes, the same certified fraud examiner's affidavit referenced an invalid notary registration tied to a second will filed after Patricia Halloway's death, and that the probate court had, in fact, quietly reopened review of that matter 3 days earlier, once my original filing from years past resurfaced in connection with the current title dispute. Derek tried, at that point, to say this was all a misunderstanding from an old divorce, something petty I was dredging up out of spite. I opened my folder then, for the first time, and I laid 3 documents on the table, in order the way I do for any client. The original notarized will, 3 ways, dated and witnessed. The second will, with the notary registration number I had already confirmed, in writing, from the state board, had never been issued to any person. And the signature comparison analysis on the HELOC modification, showing, side by side, 6 independent examples of my genuine signature against the one filed on that loan. The bank's fraud representative asked Derek directly whether he recognized the name Gerald Wick. Derek said the name sounded familiar, a family friend, someone who'd done him a favor once. The representative asked whether Derek was aware that Mr. Wick had never held a valid notary commission in this state, at any point, for any reason. Derek didn't answer that question either. He looked instead at Callie, as if she were the one who owed him a response, which told me everything I needed to know about how that marriage had actually been built. Callie, sitting across the table, read every page. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute. Then Callie asked one question, quietly, not to me, but to Derek. She asked him how long he had known those documents were sitting behind that wall. He didn't answer her, which, in a room full of attorneys and bank officials, was its own kind of answer. Colleen, who had been silent up to that point, finally spoke. She said she remembered a phone call, years earlier, warning me to keep my own copies of things, and that she'd never fully understood why she'd felt the need to say it, until now. She looked at Derek and said, calmly, that their mother would never have wanted this. Any of it. The business dissolved in a legal review or her true wishes buried behind a wall in a basement he'd built with his own hands. Derek didn't respond to that either. He sat very still, staring at the 3 documents on the table, the way you stare at a test result you already suspect is bad news. The closing did not happen that day. It has still not happened. The refinance application was formally withdrawn by the lender pending a full fraud investigation, which meant the original balloon payment came due exactly as scheduled, 7 days later, with no mechanism in place to cover it, since Holloway Builders' cash position, once its books were finally examined by the bank's own forensic team as part of the fraud review, turned out to be far shakier than anyone outside Derek had realized. 2 large subcontractor accounts, the ones I'd first noticed discrepancies in back during our marriage, had apparently never fully reconciled in the years since, a slow bleed of unaccounted funds that had simply been managed, quietly, the same way everything in that family got managed, until there was no more managing left to do. Word travels fast in a family that size, even one that prides itself on handling things quietly. Within a week, extended cousins who hadn't spoken to me since the divorce were reaching out through mutual contacts, not out of malice, mostly out of the kind of stunned curiosity people feel when a story they thought they understood turns out to have an entirely different ending. I didn't answer most of those messages. This was never a story I wanted to tell at every family gathering for the next decade. It was simply a story that needed its facts to land in the right offices, in the right order, and once they had, I was content to let the rest of the family sort out what it meant to them in their own time, without my narration. The probate court reopened Patricia's estate for formal review 2 weeks after that closing meeting, based on the invalid notary registration and my original certified filing. Colleen and Todd, represented now by their own attorney, requested a full accounting of Holloway Builders' finances as part of that review, since the second, Disputable had granted Derek controlling interest in the business specifically. What that accounting found, over the following 2 months, was a pattern of internal loans, undocumented withdrawals, and vendor overpayments that, taken together, painted a picture of a business that had been quietly propping up Derek's personal finances for years, using his mother's declining capacity and eventually her death as cover. I want to be honest about something here. I take no pleasure in describing what happened to Derek over the following weeks. I know some of you watching want a villain who gets dragged through the mud and enjoys none of it, and in a strict sense, that is what happened. But it happened slowly, through paperwork, through subpoenas, through a state notary board investigation that eventually connected Gerald Wick, the man on that business card, to 2 other fraudulent notarizations in neighboring counties, opening a broader criminal referral that had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with a pattern he'd apparently run more than once. Derek was never someone I needed to punish directly. I only ever needed to stop protecting him from the consequences everyone else had spent years managing on his behalf, including me. 3 weeks after that closing meeting, the notary board's investigator called me directly, asking whether I'd be willing to provide a formal statement regarding the invalid registration number, since my original filing had become one of 2 separate leads pointing at the same man. I said yes, without hesitation. 6 weeks after that, the county district attorney's office opened a formal inquiry into whether the second will constituted a criminal forgery under state law, separate from the civil probate dispute, which meant Derek now had 2 attorneys instead of 1, and a mounting legal bill that Holloway Builders' shrinking accounts could no longer quietly absorb. The bank formally voided the fraudulent portion of the HALOC modification once their own signature analysis confirmed what mine already had, restoring the loan to its original, legitimate $22,000 balance from that Tuesday 4 years earlier, the one I had actually signed. That meant Callie and Derek's house was never seized, never foreclosed, contrary to what you might expect from a story like this. Callie kept her home. She simply no longer had a husband whose finances she could trust, or, as it turned out over the following month, a marriage she wanted to continue once she understood the full shape of what he'd hidden from her for the entire 18 months they'd been together. Holloway Builders did not survive the estate review. Once Colleen and Todd's attorney pushed for a full accounting as part of contesting the second will, and once that accounting surfaced years of undocumented internal transfers, the business's primary bonding company pulled its coverage, which for a construction firm is close to a death sentence, since without bonding, you cannot legally bid most commercial or municipal contracts. Derek dissolved the company 4 months after that closing meeting, folding what remained of its assets into a settlement with his siblings that finally, after everything, distributed Patricia's actual estate the way she had originally, legally, and with full mental capacity, intended it to be distributed 3 years earlier. Colleen called me once during that settlement process, the only time she's ever called specifically to talk about what I'd done rather than what needed doing next. She said she'd spent 3 years assuming her mother had simply changed her mind near the end, the way people sometimes do, and that she'd talked herself out of asking harder questions because grief made it easier to accept a simple explanation than to fight for a complicated one. She thanked me for not accepting the simple explanation on her behalf. I told her I hadn't done it for her. Not really. Not at first. I'd done it because a number didn't match another number, and I'd never learned how to look away from that, even when looking away would have been so much easier. She said that was, in its own strange way, the most Holloway thing she'd ever heard, and for the first time since I'd known her, we both actually laughed. Todd, for his part, never called me directly. He sent a card instead, a plain, ordinary sympathy-style card with nothing printed inside it except a handwritten line thanking me for making sure their mother's wishes finally counted for something. I kept it. It's the only piece of that entire family's correspondence I've chosen to hold on to, mostly because it was the one time anyone in that house ever thanked me for something without immediately asking me to fix something else. Callie called me twice more in the months that followed, not crying the second time. Just tired and honest, in the way people get once the adrenaline of a crisis wears off, and what's left is just the slow work of rebuilding a life you thought you understood. She asked me, at one point, whether I hated her, for marrying him, for living in that house, for not knowing. I told her the truth. I had never hated her for a single second. I recognized her. I told her that I would help her find her own attorney, separate from anything connected to Derek's family, to make sure her name was fully protected on anything still tied to that house, and that I would answer any question she had about the paperwork, honestly and without judgment, for as long as she needed. What I would not do, I told her clearly, was become her connection back into that family. I was not interested in being invited to Holloway holidays again. Whatever relationship she and I built from here forward would exist entirely outside of Derek, and entirely on those terms, or it wouldn't exist at all. She agreed, quietly, and then asked me something I hadn't expected. She asked whether the pencil clicking thing was a real habit, or something I'd made up to seem intimidating in that conference room. I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in weeks, and told her it was real, and that my old assistant used to tease me about it mercilessly. It was a small, stupid exchange, but it was the first moment in this entire story where I felt like I was talking to a person instead of managing a case. And I think that's the moment I decided I actually wanted to stay in touch with her, not out of obligation, but because she'd earned it, simply by being honest with me when she didn't have to be. We've spoken a handful of times since, mostly about paperwork. Once, unexpectedly, about nothing important at all. Just two women who ended up standing in the same basement, years apart, holding the same kind of truth. Here's what I learned from all of this, and I mean this as plainly as I can say it. Protecting yourself does not require raising your voice. It does not require confrontation or drama or burning a single bridge before you're ready to. It requires patience and paper and the willingness to file the quiet, boring, procedural thing 3 years before anyone else understands why it mattered. A recorded affidavit sits in a county office for as long as it needs to. A certified copy waits in a probate file. An invalid notary number stays invalid, whether anyone checks it today or checks it in 5 years. The people who count on you staying quiet are usually counting on the wrong thing, because the paper doesn't forget, even when everyone around you insists on moving on. I think about Patricia sometimes, and that phrase she used to say with her hand flat on the table. We protect our own. I used to think it was about warmth, about a family closing ranks around each other the way families are supposed to. I understand it differently now. In that house, it was never really a promise. It was a filter, deciding in advance whose problems counted as everyone's problem, and whose problems were simply expected to be absorbed and forgotten. I was never asked whether I wanted to be protected. I was only ever asked to do the protecting. For years, until the day I quietly decided to extend that same instinct toward myself instead. And it turned out I was better at protecting myself than anyone in that family had ever been at protecting me. I don't regret staying quiet for as long as I did. I know some people watching this will wish I'd confronted Derek the moment I found that HELOC modification, screamed at him across our kitchen table, made him answer for it in real time. I understand that impulse. But I've spent my entire career watching what happens when people react loudly to fraud before they've finished documenting it, and it is almost never the loud person who wins. The quiet ones win, the ones who wait, who file, who let a bank's own underwriting department discover the truth on a schedule the truth was always going to arrive on anyway. I didn't destroy my ex-husband's family. I simply stopped being the last wall standing between them and the consequences they'd already built for themselves, one forged signature at a time. I think about that Tuesday in March sometimes, the one where I sat at our kitchen table and signed a $22,000 loan I actually understood, in a marriage I actually believed in, 4 years before any of this unraveled. I don't regret signing it. I don't even regret the years I spent being the family's fixer, because I learned things in that role I still use every single day, patience most of all. What I regret, if I regret anything, is how long it took me to turn that same careful attention toward protecting myself instead of everyone else. That's the only thing I'd tell my younger self, sitting at that table with a pen in her hand. Keep fixing things for other people if that's who you are. Just don't forget to keep a file on your own life too. If there's one family motto I'd offer in place of the one I grew up hearing at that table, it's this. You don't have to protect people who never bothered to protect you. You just have to protect the truth long enough for it to protect itself. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me about the moment you learned to keep your own receipts. Share this with someone who's ever been the quiet one in a room full of people who thought quiet meant weak. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because I've got another one of these coming next week. And trust me, it starts in a basement too. I'll see you in the next one.